and precede the corresponding idea of punishment by penal theories. And that goes for both the global north and global south. Beccaриa's penal enlightenment, Bentham's utilitarianism did not invent the prison sentence. Instead, they theorized on punitive practices consolidated through the specialization of workhouses and houses of correction. And likewise, in colonial formations such as the Brazilian one, punitive practices were also materially constituted chronologically before the penitentiary reform discourses arrived, giving new meaning to the latter. The category of discipline and the theme of the interference of the penalty on the body, for example, demand a critical rereading from these contexts of colonization, slavery, and mainly rural contexts. Brazil never had a correctional facility as the houses of corrections, an organized space for work constraint, even though the country's first penitentiaries were given this name. We hypothesize here that the mother institution of the Brazilian penitentiary system was not the house of correction, but the cellars and the dungeons of the 18th century prisons, which constituted spaces of overlapping of public and private powers in sharing the violence imposed on slaves, frame of the relations established between police, prison, and Brazilian people before and after abolition. Therefore, the main argument here is that the modern and civilized penitentiary project of the 19th century did not arrive late in Brazil. The point is that this project found material conditions completely different and inseparable from the colonial social formation. There was no delay, but symbiosis, and no rejection, but a rereading, producing new forms of disciplinary practice that did not exist in the North experience. The Brazilian colony actively participated in its way in the same process of accumulation of capital that gave rise in Europe and United States to correctional and penitentiary institutions. So in brief, the main three elements or tenets developed in the paper are as follows. First, the colony as a factory. And I'm trying to reread the prison and factory of Melos and Pavalini here from the Brazilian social history. This assumption is related to the labor problem. Brazil had a vast territory, occupation through large states, organization of the economy through export monoculture. So it should come as no surprise that the central problem in Brazilian economy has always been the need for labor. In the occupation of the Northeastern coast, the first attempt was through the slavery of indigenous people. In a short time, however, as we know, preference was given to the slavery of Africans. And this business became a fundamental pillar in the organization of sugar production and Brazilian people constitution. So it's impossible to agree with the transposition of European models to the Brazilian colonial formation, classifying it as a feudal or semi-feudal structure, or even as an arm of the absolutist metropolis. The factors necessary to exploit sugarcane and the enormous extension of occupied areas reveal not a semi-feudal structure, but a mercantile one, with high capital investment focused on exports. So it's a characteristic that makes the slave unit in opposition to feudal unit. In this sense, capital accumulation was external to production. Slave colonialism was placed at the service of the demands of the foreign market, generating profit like a modern factory. And this dependence relationship reveals how the dependent pole worked as a necessary counterpart to the European metropolis, where mercantile capitalism was advancing. From the second half of the 16th century, workhouses appeared. Such institutions were identified as fundamental in the process of primitive accumulation, that is, of separation between producer and means of production, transforming the means of production into capital, transforming the producer linked to land into a free worker. For this reason, prison as a penalty should not exist in pre-capitalist production system. I quote Foucault, for example. How would prison not be the penalty in a society where freedom is a good that belongs to everyone in the same way, and to which everyone is linked by a universal and constant feeling? So there's no way to answer this question in slavery, because the question itself must change. Brazilian colony could not have prison as a penalty either, or an institution like the workhouses, even though it had a capitalist production system. And this because of slavery. Perhaps what existed in the Brazilian colonial formation, this is a hypothesis, would only be the process of capital creation from the importation of equipment, technique, but without a proletariat, a demand that will only appear at the end of the 19th century. Celso Furtado would agree with that, with the understanding of the entire colony as a factory. I quote him. Slave labor can be compared to the installations of a factory. The investments consist in the purchase of the slave. And likewise, Darcy Ribeiro, which is another important Brazilian scholar. In the second element would be the colony as a prison. The colony was also constituted as a great prison, referring not only to confinement, but above all to the impact of slavery on all aspects of social organization. The colonial formation has already been described by Zaffaroni in this sense, as a huge kidnapping institution. It's difficult to specify when the first colonial prisons appeared. There were, for example, the construction of a colonial prison in Rio de Janeiro in 1567 and in the 1600s. What I would like to highlight here is that when penitentiary reform arrived, it found a country of landlords, and Brazilian prisons functioned as support to private power in the flogging and control of escaped slaves. In that way, the sense of penitentiary and its genesis can be associated not with the exercise of disciplinary power as a pedagogy of subordination of the free workforce, but with the peculiar relationships established between public and private authorities in the sharing of punitive practices concerning slaves. And so the dungeons inside the prisons were a peculiar space, rich in meaning. They were places for the custody and the application of corporal punishment on slaves, also spaces of differentiation between slave prisoners and non-slave prisoners. Among its peculiarities, there is the possibility of these cellars being rented by the owners, so that state could be in charge of flogging their slaves, or still to wait for the master to fetch his runaway and recaptured slaves. So instead of hierarchical surveillance, examination, normalizing sanctions, therefore the resources by Foucault, the flog always prevail. In this sense, the third tenet would be the difference in the concept of discipline. The moral or religious element of the penitentiary invention had, especially in the North American experience, a strong Quaker influence. As we know, the transition from a medieval religious perspective to a Protestant one, with the change in the political meaning of charity, was decisive for the penitentiary system of Philadelphia, of Auburn, based on the axis of isolation, religion, and work. Here, the Jesuit missions and reductions combine the catechism of the Indians and the use of their labor, and they, indeed, perhaps it's another hypothesis, came closer to the disciplinary concept fought in Europe. However, in another context, the missions lived in subsistence economies, for example. The Jesuits were priests of the Society of Jesus, an order created by Inácio de Loyola in 1534. It is reported that in the region of Pará, in the north of Brazil, for example, the Jesuits managed the voluntary cooperation of indigenous labor for harvesting forest products. And the Jesuits opposed the enslavement of the indigenous people and clashed with settlers, pioneers, landowners, and the metropolis. They were persecuted from all sides, attacked, and at the end expelled from Portugal and Brazilian lands in 1759. But the Italian Jesuit, Jorge Benci, transcribed his speeches and sermons delivered in Bahia through the 16th century in a book published in 1705, one of the most important documents of Brazilian history. It's very interesting. And Benci argues that punishments would serve to, I quote, control and discipline for fear of punishment and criticize disproportionate punishments. And moreover, he concludes, the most appropriate punishment would be whipping, in proportion to the seriousness of the offenses. But, in his words, no sanction would better lead to amendment of life than prisons. So, also here with Benci, we see that prison and flog are always walking together in Brazil. According to Benci, more than any other punishment, imprisonment and whipping brings down the pride, breaks the pride, and acts against idleness, would avoid longing for freedom and subordination. However, the Jesuit proposal and Benci speech distance from the concept of disciplinary power when his whole perspective is contaminated by the racial element. That is, by the association between the slavery of Black people and the violence of manual labor, which is another fundamental component for a better understanding of the penitentiary invention in Brazil. Bench justifies slavery as a sanction applied by God to the sin of Ham, who saw Noah naked, is appointed as an ascendant of the generations of, in his words, these blacks who serve us. The author goes on to say that whites can also sin, but they need, in his words, very repeated lessons, while blacks do not need much time to become doctors of malice. And this because they are more skillful for all kinds of evils than whites. And this would be the reason for the need for occupation by work. This association of a manual labor with an idea of violence and infamy as a product of slavery, a sign of low social reputation, finished by emptying any content of alleged moral reform of prison sentence. In short, as a conclusion, we can conclude that colonialism and slavery, in this sense, in this context of Brazilian social formation, produced material conditions different from those at the base of the disciplinary project of the global North, conditions that reform and resignify the penitentiary reform proposal. The representation of uncivilized masses replaced the idea of the correctable citizen. And an issue and a dilemma on the extent to which they would be part or not be part of a national project of modernization and unification of the country after abolishing slavery. So here we have the praise of miscegenation as a key to national unity, but which did not explicitly oppose scientific racism, the reception of Lombroso's work. On the contrary, it concealed it, dampened it, interdicting the discussion, contributing to depoliticize the penitentiary issue. Prisons at the end would be laboratories of racial purification and not of moral regeneration. Though in all punitive experience, the productive function of social differentiation is verified, this production of this differentiation in Brazilian social formation obeyed other dynamics and conditions. And in brief, here we risk the hypothesis that the Brazilian colonial formation was constituted as a factory and as a prison in the whole territory, not limited to the correctional houses. Absent the category of disciplinary power in its original form, the national penitentiary project was born from the dungeons where public and private power overlapped for the physical punishment of slaves. This is the synthesis. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I give back the word. I don't know how much time.
No, that was perfect, Andre. You did very well on time there. Yeah, thank you so much. I guess I will hand over to our next presenter, Umidjon Toshimov. Umidjon, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Thank you, Hallam, and shout out to Luis and Massimo for their efforts to make this event possible. And let's try to share my screen. I think you can see my presentation. So the title of my presentation is The Birth of Prisons in Central Asia, Genesis of Penal Collectivism and Post-Transitional Problems of Penal Administration. So my original focus is primarily on Uzbekistan, which is located in the center of Central Asia. And so I think we have to start with some central concepts to this research. So historically, prison existed in Islamic civilization, but with strict, limited periods of confinement, since confinement was generally not meant to punish but temporarily detain. In fact, pre-modern Islamic legal texts are often reluctant to endorse prison as a punishment at all. This is not to say that Islamic jurists had no conceptions of long-term imprisonment, but in fact, some even allow the guilty to be confined until the death, which is called in Arabic taqlid fi al-habas ila al-maut, as a discretionary punishment, tazir. So there is some sort of Islamic concepts, tazir, qisas, diya, which refers to punishment in Islamic law. In terms of punitive responses, the primary focus is on hudud punishment, which is corporal punishment explicitly delineated in Islam's core sources like Quran and secondary sources, Hadith, but also retaliatory punishment like I mentioned before, qisas, and discretionary punishment, which is rendered by judges who are called qazis. Non-punitive in Islamic discourse, we had also non-punitive responses, including financial compensation, diya, and non-punishment forgiveness. So you can kind of get a sense of all these types of punishment by reading a book of Peters, which describes all sorts of punishment in a Islamic law. Given that we can predict that there were three broad sets of opinions on long-term imprisonment by Islamic jurists. First, it is the opinion that permits long-term sentences as a type of discretionary punishment, taza. They acknowledge that this punishment looks different in Islamic legal tradition, but believe political authorities have some latitude to extend it. Second is the view that considers incarceration as impermissible because it subverts Islamic law by replacing scripturally prescribed corporal punishment with prison. The final one is one that considers long-term imprisonment as a form of punishment, which is unethical and immoral. So we can refer to this as a Islamic prison abolitionist view. When we analyze punishment in pre-Tsarist period in Central Asia, there were some types of punishment which were mainly corporal punishments. They were flogging, starting from different kind of buildings and minarets, and also there were capital punishments and stoning. So, as I mentioned earlier, there were some penal institutions which are which can be referred as quasi prisons, and only aimed to detain prisoners until they could be sentenced to various punishments by rulers, let it be emirs of Bukhara or khans of Khiva and Kokand. So mainly there was 5 types of places of confinement. The first one is Sariskhana, which is stable. Second one is Abkhana, the place where I kept some water reservoir in Bukhara Emirate. And there was in the fortress of Emir, Bukhara Emir, the place which is called Childuktaran, and it could be crucial of significance because this was a special place for kind of political prisoners and relatives of ruling class. Finally, there was the place which is called Zindan, which is literally translated from Persian as Zinda is kind of person, and Don is place who kept in such places. So there is, as you can see, a general view of the main prison in Bukhara. the only source in Uzbekistan which kind of analyzes this place of confinement is written by Yusupov in 1941, when Uzbekistan was a part of Soviet Union, and it is unfortunately unfinished piece of work because of the kind of Second World War. So in Emirate, there were several prisons besides Bukhara in Hisar, Charjoy, and Badijuan, and there is no other sources which indicates that the institutions alike the prisons. So Abkhana, which is I mentioned the type of prisons which is located in Ark Bukhara. So although such definition, most people claim that there is nothing to do with water, but there is some still claims that this was previously placed for water reservations. The size of this place were approximately 15-16 meters square with a small entrance gate. Each Abkhana contained half-rooted mat and a crumbly floor caused from humidity. The duration of imprisonment differed and didn't stated in any orders of emir. However, individuals in general locked up in these facilities up to 2 years. Those students released from Abkhana were being sent to Zindans. Here also imprisoned those who sentenced to the capital punishment. It's suggested that cells in Abkhanas contained up to 40 inmates. So there was another remand facility which is called Kanahona or Bug Pit. It's also located in near the entrance of Ark, and so it was one of the harshest places of confinement. So after the invasion of Russian Empire into the Central Asia, the colonial administration created prisons in order to punish locals, and so first prison in Central Asia was created in kind of second half of 19th century in Fergana, where the stable of General Skobelev was located. Then there was a time in which after revolution, Russian Revolution, 1970, and Bolsheviks, when Bolsheviks came to the power, there was a project which all of criminologists are aware of, Gulag period. They started to create prison labor camps in order to maintain the political economy and colonize different parts of Soviet Union. So they transferred prisoners from, let's say, Uzbekistan to Siberia to colonize those places, to build roads, to build railway stations, etc. Currently, Uzbekistan inherits criminal justice system of its colonial past. Almost nothing has changed since the dissolution of Soviet Union, and administration of prisons managed by Central Department of Corrections under Ministry of Internal Affairs, as Gavin Slade mentioned before. And according to the data of World Prison Brief, the number of prison population, including those who are kept in remand prisons, is 22,867. Prison population rate per 100,000 population is 68, and number of penal institutions are currently 54, including 43 penal colonies and 11 remand prison, which is called CISO in Russian term. Last thing I would like to mention is there has always been some kind of shift in the power to punish from one institution to the other, and that was case in Uzbekistan as well as in former Soviet Union. So if we look at a book written by Adams, which analysis which kind of discuss this shift between Ministry of Justice and Ministry of Interior, there were several shifts between 1930s and 1980s. So after the solution, we can see those relation between different institutions who play a different role in shaping policy or kind of facilitating this power to punish. So, for instance, until 2016, when first president of Uzbekistan died, Ministry of Justice had under its structure the Department for Enforcement of Judicial Acts, which maintained kind of collecting peculiar punishments, so fines. Later, it has been transferred to General Prosecution Office because there was perception of there was perception among ruling elite and society that prosecution office can better deal with that task. And indeed, there was some progress, and it could be stated as success story by this office. So there is again one central power to kind of supervise, which is called in Russian term Общий надзор. That's general supervision of compliance with laws. And it's considered as an eminent power of prosecution office, but there is also project that to take over this power from prosecution office and hand over it to Minister of Justice. So I think that's it. And thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Yeah, I guess I will hand the floor over to our discussant, Ashley Rubin, to make a few comments on the papers.
Great. Thank you both for these two great papers, and thank you to Luis and Maximo and everyone behind the scenes organizing and arranging this, and thank you for inviting me. Okay, so these are two great papers that help us to understand the rise, the evolution, and the ongoing hold of the prison across two countries that I don't often see written about. The Brazil paper offers an explicit comparison to the global north, while the Uzbekistan paper gives us a longue durée history of penality in that country, along with a sweep across its current landscape. With their different approaches, each gives us a useful case study that highlights elements that are distinctive for those of us used to researching and reading about countries in the global north. So Brazil offers an interesting case to contrast the rise of the prison in Europe because of the distinct layers of colonialism, and in this case, I mean as a land that has experienced long-term settler colonialism and slavery, as well as complicated racial politics surrounding its indigenous, Black, Mestizo, and white Spanish populations. I'd suggest including more comparison to North American prisons as part of the global north comparison, because the intense reliance on slavery there and similar racial dynamics, you might see a different kind of comparison than you would with Europe, which is kind of your main interlocutor. I'd also like to see less reliance on the Marxist explanation for the rise of the prison in the global north. And I think this is especially relevant if you turn more towards North America. And I mention this because since you're using evidence of the Marxist explanation in the comparison, if the Marxist account is incomplete for the global north, which many scholars argue it is, then it's kind of setting up a false comparison between the global north and Brazil. So when the Marxist explanation kind of turns out to be incomplete for Brazil, and it's seen as complete for the global north, that kind of makes it look more different than it actually is. But of course, there are plenty of interesting and important differences. Just as an example, gaining legitimacy in the eyes of more powerful or established societies was an important reason for getting the prison adopted in other places outside of Europe that had no technical or labor-related need for it. So in, for example, Hawaii, or I should say the Kingdom of Hawaii, or in southern and western United States prior to the US Civil War, that legitimacy role is really important for adopting the prison. Why was that not a bigger motivation in other colonized settings like Brazil, or was it perhaps? Likewise, there was a lot of copying going on. For example, Emperor Dom Pedro II actually visited Eastern State Penitentiary in the United States during his reign, and presumably some other US prisons as part of that tour, which was something that a lot of rulers of a bunch of different countries from Europe, South America, and eventually Asia as well, would come and like tour the United States prisons and sometimes European prisons as well, depending on where people were from. And visits like these help to spread prisons on virtually identical systems around the US and in more modified forms around the world. So I'd be curious to hear more about what the emperor took from that visit, and how that might kind of change your view of the kind of transposition argument. Okay. Uzbekistan offers an interesting case as a Central Asian country and a former Soviet country, but also one that diverges from the modal trends in other former Soviet countries. Some of the recent progressive reforms, like the abolition of the death penalty and short-term confinement, as well as the declining use of long-term confinement, are really interesting. I'd like to hear more about the alternatives that have emerged to make some of these shifts possible. I know some of this wasn't, it was more in the paper, I think, but that was super interesting. For both papers, I'd like to see more attention given to what we mean by prison. Like, how are we actually defining prison? Because it's a word that's often used and kind of used in various different ways. So sometimes we use it now and in the past interchangeably with what we would kind of see as a jail, or in some countries called a remand prison. But like typically we think of these as distinct types of institutions with different kind of definitions and features and so on. So each paper discusses myriad forms of incarceration or confinement, and distinguishes across them, including workhouses or temporary detention. But I'm wondering if these are all considered types of prisons, or if they're seen as distinct types of carceral facilities, but not necessarily prisons, or in one case, a quasi-prison. And I'm pushing on this because how we demarcate something as a prison, in the sense that we would recognize it today as something that is distinctive, impacts what our analyses are going to look like. For example, if we call a facility a prison that includes any type of confinement, regardless of the population, the duration, or the purpose, then we see a story with way more continuity over time. But if we limit the definition of a prison only to those places that officially specialize in long-term confinement to punish people convicted of serious crimes, then we see a more dramatic shift, but still with ongoing continuities, of course, but still a recognizable shift in the adoption of this kind of distinctive type of facility, even if it owes kind of features to previous institutions. That might be especially true for the Brazil paper, If we instead treat carceral facilities as having distinct iterations or templates, then we see repeated instantiations of change. That might be especially true for the Uzbekistan paper. But the point is to offer a bit more discussion about what prison means today in your respective countries, and where that idea emerged and how it's different from other similar carceral facilities across space and time. And how did the people involved in these changes see what they introduced as new or as different from what came before, or if they also saw it as continuations of what came before with just minor tweaks along the way. For example, in the Uzbekistan paper, it would be helpful to know if the use of incarceration in the 18th century was viewed by people at the time as new or just more of the same. Likewise, for the Brazil paper, for comparative purposes and thinking about the applicability of certain theoretical frameworks like Foucault, if you're looking at non-prison carceral facilities, that can explain the lack of Foucaultian elements in some of those non-prison carceral facilities. And then finally, a few other questions for both papers. Do we see regional differences within these countries? And then second, moving away from major social changes, who are the groups responsible for these shifts? And finally, do we see resistance to any of these developments? And if no, or if the resistance fails, why is that? So those are my comments. Thank you both for two really exciting projects.